Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show, brought to you by Tissot, official timing partners of the Tour de France. Coming up this week, 5 things we learnt from the most exciting first week of the Tour de France that I can remember. We'll also look back at the opening 3 days of the biggest stage race on the women's calendar, the Giro Donne, and go over the latest transfer rumours too. We'll start with the Tour de France, which has seen high drama play out pretty much every single day. The biggest story of them all, though, was of reigning champion Tadej Pogačar. He won the individual time trial ahead of some top specialists in that discipline, and then demolished the whole field on the first mountain stage on Saturday to Le Grand Bornand. All of it was very exciting to watch, but it's left us all wondering if there could conceivably be any excitement left in the battle for the yellow jersey. The gap between 1st and 10th after stage 8 was over twice as large as any of the previous 10 editions of the race, and after riding clear of all of his main rivals again on yesterday's stage to Jeanne, Pogačar goes into today's rest day with a margin of 2 minutes and 1 second over Ben O'Connor, more on him later, and at least 5 minutes on everybody else. That 8th stage was gripping to watch. Pogačar even looked like he might be able to win it. Such was the speed with which he passed the breakaway riders one by one in the big ring as he ascended the Col de la Colombière. Thankfully though, for Dylan Teuns of Bahrain victorious, Pogačar hadn't made contact with him by the summit, and the Belgian was able to increase his advantage on the descent, clearly willing to take more risks with the stage win up for grabs, and he came to the line solo for what was a very emotional stage win.
How do you compare this victory with the one at La Planche des Belles Filles?
Oh, it's just amazing to win in the Tour, and yeah, it's a nice taste.
You asked your wife to marry you at La Planche des Belles Filles. What are you going to do in Le Grand Bornand?
I don't know. It was more or less an honor to my granddad who died just before the Tour, so that's why I was pointing up. He died just like we had the funeral 1 week before. I had like a few days before I had to go to the Tour, so it was a bit emotional for me this last 10K.
And he must be very proud of you.
I hope so. I think so, yeah.
Thank you.
Just goes to show you, we've got no idea what a lot of the riders are going through mentally as we watch them race. Well done, Dylan. Pogačar, though, would finish in a group just under a minute back, but it would be exactly 3.5 minutes before the next GC contender crossed the line. It was a performance so dominant, we weren't only questioning whether the race was already done and dusted, but whether the performance we just witnessed could be believed. Now, it is unfortunate that we can't watch something like that without being suspicious, but it's no wonder we can't, given the sport's not so distant past. This was my take on it during the breakaway pre-race show with Orla yesterday morning on GCN+.
We do have to reflect, Dan, not least because we're hearing some noises from teams on the ground, but anyone who watched yesterday's performance with a keen eye on the history of this sport, it's understandable that some might feel uncomfortable. It was an exceptional display, wasn't it?
Yeah, and everybody's right to question what they saw yesterday, especially those of us that have been fans of the sport, watching the sport, and even within the sport for a long time, because we got used to seeing performances that were too good to be true, and it turned out most of them were. Unfortunately, that didn't happen at the time, but often in subsequent years where people were found guilty afterwards. And that history is going to live with the sport for a long, long time. We're going to have generations of riders that are still going to have to answer the questions that have been left by the riders before them. So we can discuss it, there's no evidence that he's cheated in any way, but there wasn't any evidence in the past. What we can look at is his history within the sport, and that has been exceptional from day dot, really, from being a junior where won some big races, but from first year senior, 5th in the Tour of Slovenia behind big names, 4th in that same race the following year, winning the Tour de l'Avenir. And since he's turned pro, he won his second race as a pro, the Algarve race. And it's not huge, but the names that are there are very big. He beat them all. He beat them all again a couple of months later in California. He came 3rd overall at the Vuelta as a 19-year-old. 3 stages along the way, best young rider, was still away in the last week. And then we move on to last year, where he was exceptional again and won the Tour de France with that performance we saw on La Planche des Belles Filles. So he has been consistent. In years gone by when we saw exceptional performances, they were often for the race that rider wanted to peak at. And before that, if you looked at their results, they weren't winning across the board. Whereas at least with Tadej Pogačar, in trying to believe in him, I'm looking, well, he's been very, very consistent. He's always there. It's not like he's going like this and up and down and everywhere else. He's just an exceptional athlete. And, you know, like I said, we are right to question it, and we will continue to do so. But from what I've seen, he's always been that exceptional athlete, and he's still young, so of course he's still going to improve. It is a very difficult subject to tackle, and I do feel sorry for a new generation of riders who are still having to answer the questions left by those that came before them. However, I do think it's healthy to be sceptical. The worst thing we could all do is become nonchalant or blasé or deliberately ignorant. Otherwise, the sport could very quickly descend back to its murky past. Now, we have no evidence to say that Pogačar is up to anything against the rules, but we do have evidence of a very long string of exceptional performances, despite still being just 22 years old. Many of them I listed off there on the breakaway, and I do personally take some sort of comfort in seeing that those exceptional performances aren't sporadic. He is consistently at the very top of his game from the start to the finish of each season, and in all 3 seasons in which he's been professional, in those 3 years, he's never got past the end of February without winning a stage race. And he also continues to be at the head of affairs at races that take place after his big goals later in the year. That's my take on it. Yours may well be very different in either direction, and if you'd like to discuss it, you're more than welcome to in the comments section just down below. But please try to keep it sensible, factual and friendly though, please. Also, let us know if you think the Tour de France is already over. This is actually a question we posed to you in the form of a poll after Saturday's stage on the GCN app, and over half of you said it's now a fight for second place at this year's Tour de France. The second thing we learnt last week is that Primoz Roglic is human. Before last year's final time trial to La Planche de Belleville, he could often come across as aloof in interviews. You just never felt like you learnt anything about who Roglic is as a person. However, in that reaction to that surprise and shocking defeat for Roglic, he was gracious and open, and at a time where we would all have forgiven him for being shell-shocked and unwilling to answer the difficult questions the media had to pose to him. And this year, ironically, I think will have gained him even more fans. Not only did he soldier on the day after he lost half the skin off his left side, not only did he pull out a solid performance in the time trial, but when it all came undone for him on stage 6, he wasn't angry, he wasn't sulking, and he even made the time to give a young fan his water bottle. Now, the injuries from that crash would ultimately see him head home before yesterday's stage, but that vulnerability has humanised Primoz Roglic in my eyes, who had got to the point where he was seen as robotic both on and off the bike. And I'm sure, like me, you can't wait to see him back to his best. I wonder how different this tour would have been as well, had it been for Primoz Roglic being there on top form as opposed to injured. Now, we also learnt that however much Mark Cavendish doesn't want us to mention it, he could realistically surpass the great Eddy Merckx in terms of Tour de France stage wins. He now sits on 32, and so he needs just 2 more to equal that record and 3 more to surpass it. With at least 4 further stages that are likely to finish in the sprint, and with Ewan, Melier and Demar now out of the race, there's a real chance that Cavendish could do what most of us thought was impossible just a few months ago. Even if he doesn't, you've got to take your hat off to a man who's been written off at least twice in his career. It's rare to see someone at the top of their game as a sprinter in their mid-30s, even more so with someone who first won it on the biggest stage 13 years earlier. Patrick Lefevre, the team manager of the Koenig Quick-Step, in his latest column for Het Nieuwsblad, speculated that if the dream scenario came true, Cavendish winning his 34th or 35th Tour de France stage whilst in the green jersey on the Champs-Élysées, then he wouldn't be surprised to see him retire there and then, right at the top of the sport. That would be a tough decision to make for Cavendish, but what a way that would be to bow out of the sport. We also had confirmation last week that Matej Mohoric of Bahrain Victorious is an endurance junkie. He completed his collection of Grand Tour stage wins, and in his post-race interview, he pointed out that each of those had come on the longest stage of that particular Grand Tour. In this case, it was the 249-kilometre epic to Le Creusot. He claimed that he won through being tactically astute, and whilst there's no doubt he did make some good decisions along the way, when you looked at his power file on Strava, it was also quite clear that it mainly came down to a huge amount of power. 277 watts average for 5 hours and 42 minutes, and that included the neutralised zone and then a 16-minute block at 400 watts as he gapped his remaining breakaway companions to eventually go solo. Now, as another example of Bahrain victorious resetting their ambitions at a Grand Tour after their GC leader abandoned through a crash, and Dylan Teuns would make it 2 from 2 the following day of the race. We also witnessed Mathieu van der Poel and Wout van Aert's careers continue to collide at the very pinnacle of the sport. It's fascinating watching these two cyclocross riders making history over the years, something that is likely to continue for many more to come. And whilst they came to the race with very different jobs and very different ambitions, after the stage won by Mohoric, they sat first and second in the general classification, Van der Poel having won a stage and just about to spend his 6th day in the yellow jersey at his first Tour de France. Van Aert's dream of taking yellow himself would not come to fruition, at least it hasn't yet, but those two riders have brought so much interest, so many new fans into the sport. Long may it continue. Yesterday, it was another brutal day in the saddle with 3 standout performances from my point of view. Up front, Ben O'Connor was for a while the virtual yellow jersey of the race. And whilst that wouldn't materialise, he would take a stage win and the 20th at the Tour de France for his team, AG2R. Like Mohoric, O'Connor uploaded his power file to Strava and it's mind-blowing. An average power, not normalised, but an average power of 313 watts for 4 hours and 37 minutes. An effort of 20 minutes near the start at 406 watts to get into the breakaway and 352 watts for the last 20 minutes on his own. All of that in the pouring rain at a weight of 67 kilograms. No wonder he came home with one of the biggest winning margins that I can remember for a solo rider in a long time at the Tour de France. It would be over 5 minutes before Matteo Cattaneo of the Koenig Quickstep rolled across the line in 2nd place. Not far behind him, Sonny Colbrelli. Yes, you heard that right. The Italian champion took a podium spot in the toughest mountain stage of the race so far and one of the toughest for the whole 3 weeks. In doing so, he gave himself 15 points in the green jersey classification to add to the 20 he'd picked up at the intermediate sprint. The other big ride, though, once again came from Tadej Pogačar, whose team, UAE Team Emirates, really rose to the challenge, I've got to say, on their first day defending the yellow jersey. Ineos Grenadiers took up the pace setting on the final climb to Tignes, but would end up losing more time to the Slovenian, even if Carapaz did move himself up 1 place to 5th on GC. So this is how things look in the top 10 going into the first rest day. Pogačar leading Ben O'Connor, who himself moved up 11 places to 2nd on GC with that remarkable ride. And he, in turn, is now over 3 minutes ahead of Rigoberto Urán, who's in 3rd. After that, it's Vingegaard, Carapaz, Mas, Kelderman, Lutsenko, Guillaume Martin and Gaudu who round out the top 10. And the top 10 are separated by a whopping 7 minutes and 22 seconds. Pogačar is of course also the best young rider, but that jersey will be worn on his behalf by Jumbo-Visma's default leader Vingegaard, and it's Nairo Quintana who is the polka dot jersey wearer. He didn't have enough energy to take the stage win yesterday, but the points he picked up means he's 8 points clear of Woods and 11 in front of Poels in 3rd place. In the green jersey competition, it is still Mark Cavendish that's wearing that. He was shepherded home by Michael Merkur and Tim de Klerk, 2 minutes inside the time limit yesterday, but there are 7 riders who finished outside that time limit and therefore won't be allowed to start stage 10. Demar, his teammate Guarnieri, De La Place, De Bod, Coquart, Vliegen, and the last man across the line, Nick Delmini of Quebec and Nexthash. He'd crashed on one of the first descents, but courageously ploughed on, clearly wanting to honour the race and crossing the line to the applause of the people who were still there at the finish line, well over an hour down on the stage winner. Well done to you, Nick. Now, just before we finish with the Tour de France for this week, this is the Colnago that Pogačar will be using whilst he's in the yellow jersey. Now, I know a lot of you love your tech, so make sure you tune into this week's GCN Tech Show because I'm sure that Alex and Ollie will be taking a closer look at this bike over there. Down in Italy, we have seen the opening 3 stages of the Giro Donne play out. The race started with a lengthy team time trial of 26.7 kilometres from Fasano to Cuneo. And it was Ale Ljubljana BTC who set the early benchmark, but blitzing around the course were last year's winners of this stage, Trek Segafredo. They averaged 47.5 kilometres per hour on a course that was slightly uphill the whole way. All eyes after them were then on the super team of SD Worx, but they couldn't better Trek, coming across the line 8 seconds slower than them. It was the American Ruth Winder who had crossed the line first from her team, and so she took the Maglia Rosa into stage 2. And there was no easing into things for the riders in the race. Straight into the mountains on a 100-kilometre stage to Prato Nevoso. And it would be Winder herself who'd do the pace setting at the foot of that final climb, reeling in the breakaway. But it wasn't long before SD Worx decided to take matters into their own hands. Ashley Millman-Pasio setting a high tempo which saw a group reduce further in size. Anna van der Breggen still had enough energy left though to attack, and she would never be seen again, extending her advantage all the way to the finish line and taking what was the one of a 1-2-3 for her team. Millman-Pasio came in second, 1 minute and 22 seconds behind the world champion, with Demi Vollering out-sprinting Marta Cavalli to take third. And it's left them in a very commanding position on GC. Also 1-2-3, and in that same order, with a gap of over 1.5 minutes to Lizzie Deignan, who went into stage 3 in 4th place on GC. Stage 3 was less mountainous, but still hilly. Perfect for a breakaway, although it did take a long time to establish. 4 women would eventually go up the road: Elise Chabi of Canyon SRAM, with Brandt of Trek Segafredo, Lippert of Team DSM, and Marianne Vos, the boss of Jumbo Visma. With none of them a threat on GC, they were allowed an advantage of almost 4 minutes. Brandt opened up the sprint first, but in the end was no match for Vos, who took her 29th stage win at the race. Now, one of those 29 was in a prologue, but her 28 road stage wins come in just 73 road stage starts. That is a success rate of over 38%. And this latest win was an emotional one for Vos.
It's, of course, it's incredible to win 29 times, but it's when you still can do your passion and when you can do what you love. Yeah, it's so strange to lose Jolien Verschuren this week due to cancer, and then we're here. We think we suffer, but there's so much more in life, and yeah, it was. I thought about her, and it gave me extra power. I knew how dedicated she was, and yeah, I wanted to do a special race for her.
Marianne Vos there, dedicating her win to Jolien Verschuren, who sadly passed away last week after a 3-year battle with brain cancer. The 31-year-old Belgian had combined racing and winning at the very highest level with being a schoolteacher. Our sincere condolences go to her friends and family. Rest in peace, Jolien. Very sad, and if you'd like to read more about Jolien and her life, there's a great article written by Jose Bean which you can find over on Cycling Tips. Going to move on now though to what is coming up on GCN+. 2 big races on this week, and it's the 2 that we've been talking about in the first part of the show. Week 2 of the Tour de France and the final 7 stages of the Giro Donne. Bike racing at its very best. Don't forget, you can also tune into our pre- and post-race breakaway shows about the Tour de France on GCN+, if you are in the right territory. There are restrictions on both those races, so please check what is available where you are. But for those of you who are able to, and perhaps have already been joining us, I hope you've been enjoying our coverage of the race so far. Also on GCN+ this week, 2 more films. So on Friday, we will be trying to decide once and for all which are the 10 greatest Grand Tour climbs. I was joined by William Fotheringham, Brian Smith and some special guests on that one. Whilst tomorrow, we've got a film about Mont Ventoux. So we sent our French presenters Loïc Chatou and Florian Chabal to the mythical climb to see if they could tackle it from all 3 sides on the same day. And I think it's safe to say the challenge wasn't made any easier by the weather. Here's a sneak preview.
Certainly it's one of the hardest climbs in the world, but it is suited to somebody that can really hold a steady, hard rhythm.
Je crois qu'on a des records. On a eu un record ressenti de 320 km/h, c'est un truc de...
Je veux pas te faire péter, Flo, j'accélère parce qu'il fait froid, on est d'accord.
On avait eu le temps de se refroidir et là ça a été une erreur fatale. Donc après psychologiquement il a fallu vivre avec ça.
C'est beau là, il n'y a pas de casse-couille. Nickel.
Si, j'en vois un moi.
As mentioned, all GCN Plus films are available to all GCN Plus subscribers, and that particular one will be available from tomorrow. And later on today, you'll be able to watch this week's World of Cycling, where I'll be joined by Sean the King Kelly to get his thoughts on the opening week of the Tour de France. Right, we are going to finish with some more transfer rumours. The Norwegian pairing of Alexander Kristoff and Sven-Erik Bystrøm are rumoured to be moving away from UAE Team Emirates and over to Intermarché Wanty-Gobert. And there are also murmurs of Marc Soler going on the move. He's been with the Movistar team since he turned pro back in 2015, but he might be moving to UAE Team Emirates from next year. Also heading to that squad is Finn Fisher-Black, younger brother of Niamh, who rides for SD Worx. He spent the last 2 seasons on the Jumbo-Visma development squad and recently finished 4th overall at the Baloise Belgium Tour behind Remco Evenepoel. OK, that's all for this week's Racing News Show, but we'll be back, of course, tomorrow for the Tour de France. We hope to see you then, but bye for now.